Welcome to the stage, Randy Peterson, SCADA Superintendent at San Jacinto River Authority. Randy will be presenting Network Asset Visibility, Fundamental for OT Cybersecurity.
Good afternoon. So I'm really excited to be here. I've heard a word today that I really wanted to focus on for a minute, and that was context. Because to me, there is no meaning unless you give things context. And so that's kind of one of the things I wanted to try and kind of work through this presentation was how do we give all of this, especially asset visibility, some context, the things that we build off of our asset visibility, how do we give that all context and meaning behind it? And so for me, context, we've got to kind of start with the journey that I personally and San Jacinto River Authority have personally taken through this. San Jacinto River Authority, we're one of the 10 large river authorities out in Texas. And I came from an IT background focusing on OS deployment, OS recovery, and then I found this really cool world of OT and something just completely different, but so intriguing to me personally. And so I wanted to dive into that, and then the security aspect of that. And that's kind of the context of how I got started. I came out there and we were looking at a lot of manual systems, manual operations, and this was operators, going out, turning things on and off by hand, driving, windshield time between all these different sites to check levels, check pressures. And then we wanted to move into automation from that. So we started putting out the instrumentation. We started putting in PLCs, all the wiring, network switches, servers to run our HMIs, historians, interfaces into business networks. And all of that kind of brought up the big, scary change, the big, scary thing that we needed to address, and that was cybersecurity. Because we were, like others, we saw the headlines of this entity got hit by ransomware, this entity got hacked, and it was questions of, well, what are we doing to protect our SCADA system? We can't, or we don't want to be unable to deliver safe, clean water to the people in our community. We don't want to be the headline. We're talking industrial systems. These can cause damage, loss of life even. We've got to address cybersecurity. We have to have that plan in place, and we have to ensure that our system stays up and running. And so getting that foundation, the fundamentals in place for us was vital. We knew that was going to be a starting point to build off of, and for that was asset visibility. And so the first few times I heard asset visibility, it was great. Get asset visibility in your environment, in your network. But I never really got a clear definition of what asset visibility was. What technologies do I use to get asset visibility? How do I go about this whole process? And so that was something, we had to kind of figure out along the way. And what we had to move to was a detailed understanding. So we were looking at moving from this cloud that was our OT network, our OT devices, servers, network switches. A cloud is just an unknown. We didn't have visibility. Now we had inventory lists. It was mentioned earlier, that Excel spreadsheet that lists all the different assets you have out there. That's great. We knew we had devices, but that wasn't the detailed understanding. That wasn't real asset visibility. The asset visibility is that detailed understanding, and to me, Purdue model kind of makes it easy to explain, which is why I have it up here. It's understanding where those devices are in your network, how they're communicating, talking to one another, what protocols they're using. That's kind of the detailed understanding we need for asset visibility. So we need to know where are connections between the IT and the OT system. We need to know Where are our PLCs? Where are our instruments? Where are our sensors all connecting into our process network? What protocols are those using? How are they communicating? Who are they talking to? Who's talking to them? And then finally, where are all our HMIs located? Where are those connections? Where are our operator workstations? Where are our engineering workstations? Where are all our servers? Making sure we know all that detailed information. Make sure we know how traffic moves through our network. So we decided that this was going to be a combination of 4 different sources of information, really. No single source would capture everything we wanted for full asset visibility. So the first component in this asset visibility was going to be a physical inspection, physical walkthroughs. And that's exactly what it sounds like. It's taking the time to physically walk through all the different areas of the plant, or multiple plants, multiple facilities even. Then we needed passive monitoring. We needed some method to capture all that network data, all the metadata contained within network packets, and put that into a map. Third, we needed active scanning in our environment. And this one, I know is controversial to a lot of people, but we wanted something that is actively polling devices, pulling SNMP information. Is the device alive? Has the device checked in X amount of, in so many minutes, X minutes? Has the device rebooted? Things like that. And finally, we wanted configuration management. What devices are being changed? Who's making those changes? Why are they making those changes? Is all that information being documented, backed up, giving us that context around those assets? So those were going to be the kind of 4 key components for us to build out our full asset visibility program that we would then use to improve our cyber posture and even build on going forward in the future. And later I'll share a little bit of what we're getting into now and that we have asset visibility in place. So why are all these things part of your asset visibility, or why do I honestly believe each of these should be incorporated in your asset visibility? Well, I'm going to break down a few things we found when we started going through all these things. So the physical walkthroughs, as I mentioned, this is exactly what it sounds like. We went out and we physically walked through all the areas in the plants. We drove to multiple facilities, even hitting every water well site, every lift station out in the field. Even though they may seem very, very similar, we need to put eyes on each and every one of them. Sometimes this meant we had to coordinate with departments, get the proper safety equipment. We had to go down into the pipe galleries. We had to climb on top of towers. Other times we had to get our maintenance departments out there to de-energize panels, open up these panels. But all of it was worth it. Now, safety risks with all of those, so please coordinate those. Don't just go climb a tower without fall protection on or something like that. But we found a lot of different things when we started doing the physical inspections. Some of those, I'll share. One of them we found, we went out there and opened up a PLC panel, and I assured people, you're not going to find this in our network. Open this panel up, and there's a cell modem sitting inside connected to a PLC. The vendor had actually left that in place so that they could remotely troubleshoot, remotely diagnose the PLC if there was ever an issue and we had to call them. Some people choose to have this in their environment. Contractually, some vendors may even require this. But it's one of those things that same remote access method that your vendor uses could be exploited by a cyber attack. So weigh the risks versus the reward or the benefits and see, is this something you really want in your environment? That's one of those we had to go through and do. Another one that came up was I walked into a control room and I saw an operator workstation sitting there on an Ethernet cable running, 2 Ethernet cables, one running in each direction. What we found out is they had actually put 2 network cards in the workstation and bridged the IT and the OT network with that workstation, allowing traffic to actually bypass the firewall. So we had to kind of fix that. But all these things we're finding with physical walkthroughs. Then there were other times where we found that devices had just been unplugged, turned off, removed, or documentation was out of date. We needed to update our control diagrams, our network diagrams, our PID loops, any of those. So these were all just methods that only physical walkthroughs were able to detect. We never picked up some of these with passive monitoring, active scanning, or the config management. So physical walkthroughs really became a key component of asset visibility. The next one was passive monitoring. And this was kind of a big investment. This was really a game changer for us. But passive monitoring is getting some sort of platform in place that can make sense of all the network traffic, all the metadata in those packets. So individual PCAPs that you may do, they're great. They're a static, kind of one-time snapshot of what's going on. To really have 24/7 monitoring, you need some platform. You need sensors out there feeding that back to a central repository. When we did that, we started finding that there were a lot of devices we didn't know about. An example was we had a remote building at the back of a plant. They installed an operator workstation out there when they built that facility, and everybody just kind of forgot about it being out there because it's this remote site that nobody ever had to go to. Another thing we found out were certain meters, flow meters were installed, and they had Bluetooth capability enabled by default, default passwords on those. So anybody that was walking up close by could pick those up. But because of the passive monitoring system, we now knew those devices existed and that particular model came with Bluetooth enabled by default, able to go and address and fix those. Some of the cool things we really started seeing were east to west traffic. We saw where PLCs were talking to other PLCs. That was good. We need that for the process. Those PLCs needed to communicate. We expect that traffic. We saw where HMIs were talking with certain servers. Again, good expected traffic. This time it's kind of that north to south traffic where we start moving between security zones in the Purdue model. We even saw, operator workstations, or engineering workstations, I should say, talking out to the PLCs and the instruments. Again, this was all good expected traffic. But what we also started seeing were some worrisome things that we didn't know were happening. One of those was a printer that was out on our control network. Because we generate these reports automatically, the operations teams, they come in the morning, they've got a report with everything that was going on over the last 24 hours in the plant. They know how to start planning and running their day. Well, that printer was actually trying to talk out to a public DNS server on the internet. Luckily, this was blocked by the firewall, but it was still there, and we didn't know it was happening until we put passive monitoring in place. Then we saw core network switches we had, and these were configured to use NTP. Network time protocol is a great thing to have. I would highly recommend it. Keeps everything synchronized. But it was trying to reach out to the internet and pull network time. And it was successfully doing that. So this was a hole in the firewall that we really didn't need there and we needed to go address. Instead of reaching out to the internet, why not reach just to the business network and grab NTP from there? And then the last one we saw was really the worrisome one, probably kind of the scary one. I got a call, and hey, did you know you're actually getting scans from an IP address that traces back to a country that's known for cyber attacks? No, I did not. So we actually saw where there was a country again known for cyber attacks, and they were doing scans to a PLC buried very deep within our control system. We actually went through the full incident response, found out that it was just a scan, never actually made a successful connection, but it was still something we didn't know about until we got passive monitoring in and discovered that device is out there, and this is the communication that's happening between it and everything else. So passive monitoring really exposed where our attack vectors were, the entry points that could be leveraged to gain access to the system, and the subsequent pivot points that attackers could then use to move laterally through our network or even to get down deeper into the process layers. Then we decided to put in active scanning. We knew this would be another kind of critical component to our asset visibility. Some of these were going to be used for documentation. So we found that quickly we could set up some templates, set up some SNMP polling to reach out and grab things like serial numbers, firmware versions, even just physical device location, and have all of that documentation in place that we wanted to have. But we also saw some other aspects that we wanted to use SNMP specifically for. One of those are network ports. Are they going up and down? Typically, your OT networks, those devices remain pretty static. They don't reboot all the time like you might see on a traditional IT or business network. So if you see ports going up and down in your OT environment, this could be a really bad sign. If you're getting devices rebooting, especially in the middle of the night, why? Many devices, especially switches, radios and that, you can bypass passwords by forcing reboots. There was an old saying, and I still remember it, if I physically can touch a device, I own it. So we wanted to be aware, well, why are we seeing reboots? We need to respond to those. We need to go investigate. Is it just that the site lost power, the UPS drained and eventually shut off, or did somebody intentionally reboot that machine trying to gain access to the network or to that device? Then we wanted to look at bandwidth and processor utilization. Again, kind of giving context to what's going on in the environment. When we run backups of servers, workstations, when we do backups of PLCs, we expect large file transfers. We expect that processor and that bandwidth utilization to spike, so to speak, and to be a little bit higher. But what about other times? Are there other times where the bandwidth and the processor are spiking and we're seeing high utilization, especially on our edge devices? If we see the processor spiking on our firewall, is it externally a denial of service attack that's trying to hit? Or if it's on the internal port, is somebody trying to move large amounts of data off of the OT network? These are things, again, we kind of wanted to be aware of when we wanted to be able to respond to and investigate. And then finally, we wanted environmental factors. Some of our panels, they're out in the elements, they're out in the heat. So down in Texas, we saw 105-degree days. We knew those switches were getting hot. We knew those panels were getting hot, and we have to put the proper equipment in there so that it doesn't shut down. But what's going to happen if our central server room starts heating up? Typically, servers, rack mount switches that expect environmentally controlled conditions, they'll reach a threshold where they shut off. So if you want to bring down the SCADA system, or if an attacker wants to bring down that SCADA system and they can shut down a central AC system, if they can cause that server room to heat up, then they can force a shutdown. So we wanted to be aware of what's going on in the environment in that room. Are temperatures rising? If so, we need to get somebody out there to look at it, to get that AC back online, to get portables in place, whatever it needed. That way we could make sure that our system stays up and running. We decided to bring all that in. Network management system made that easy to kind of bring all that data together and start generating alarms, whether it's email, text, or phone calls out to on-call operations or on-call SCADA personnel. Hey, this is what's going on. We need you to come look at this and respond. So that became critical to our asset inventory. And I was talking about this with a gentleman a little bit earlier. There are remote sites where we really don't get enough traffic for the passive systems to pick up all the devices out there. We were able to bring those in using active scanning because they support SNMP. They're managed switches out there, managed devices, and we can ping them, make sure they're alive. Now, kind of our fourth component that we put in here was the configuration management. And again, to me, this is really kind of putting context around our assets. You know, we know what the configuration is, we know what that device is supposed to do, but do we know who's responsible for updating it? Do we know what changes are being made to that configuration, why they're being made, how they're being made, where they're being made from? All that context really gives us insight into our OT system and into our assets. For instance, is somebody that's not supposed to make PLC firmware updates trying to make a PLC firmware update, and why, if they are? Is it happening from a workstation that normally doesn't make those changes, that we've never seen make a PLC firmware update before? If so, has somebody gained access to that workstation and trying to update the firmware to a version with known exploits that they can then get control? Similarly, when are they happening? You know, are updates trying to be made, or are devices being brought offline, changed during non-business hours when operators aren't there to kind of monitor the system? We try to do, on the control system, we try to do all our updates while operations is there on site, not do those maybe after hours like you would see in a typical IT environment. So the configuration management really gave us kind of that context around what was going on with our assets. And then the last portion of that was really documenting and backing up those changes. That way, if we ever have a device that fails, device that needs to be replaced or rebuilt, we have documentation of the baseline configurations as well as the changes that were put in place and why, so that we can get that device back up and running with minimal downtime. So all of that really built out our asset visibility and gave us a foundation, those four components. Now, where we started going after that were some of the cool things that we could start doing. So we got the asset visibility in place. Then we went through and, okay, well, what are critical components? What are critical assets? And this includes processes. What are our crown jewels that we need to protect most? Now, I'll give an example. If you've got a membrane filtration plant, some of these membranes can be very, very advanced, very hard, if not impossible, to run manually. And if the whole plant is dependent on that process is now a critical component to our system. We need to make sure that we protect that process and invest in protecting that process. We went through a certain area in one of our plants, and tucked back in the corner was an air tank. And we found out, well, the whole process is dependent on that single air tank. If that air tank ever goes offline, or if something happens, the whole process can shut down. And that can take the whole plant offline. At that point, you stop delivering water. Well, me personally, I think critical asset, I think, the PLCs running these processes, I think critical servers. That air tank really is a critical asset, a crown jewel, because the whole process is dependent on this air tank. So that was kind of one of the cool things we found in a physical walkthrough, that we knew, hey, let's make sure we've got redundancy in place now. Let's make sure that we never have to worry about losing an air tank and shutting down a process. So knowing the critical assets, we can start prioritizing our time and our investments to make the biggest impact. Then we got into asset lifecycle upgrades, looking at those. Once we knew everything that was out there, we had things like firmware versions, model numbers. We can start looking at, well, when does this device go end of life? When do I reach a point where I can no longer upgrade the firmware? When is it end of support? Now I can start planning the replacements. I can start budgeting for this replacement, and even coordinating replacement with operationals. Operational needs or what's going on with operations, I should say. A nice example is we knew our core switches in our OT environment were coming up for end of support. We needed to get them replaced. We knew we had a few months left before that. We talked with operations and they said, well, hey, we've actually got a plant shutdown coming up where we're going to be offline for 2 days. All right, well, let's time it. So we have these core switches being replaced now during that same period so that it makes it easier on operations. It makes it easier on us doing the switch replacement. It minimizes the impact that your asset lifecycle upgrades will have. Then we started looking at vulnerability assessments, and we've been going through these. These I commonly think of CVEs, the common vulnerabilities and exposures. Last time I looked, there were a little over 214,000 CVEs out there that we were looking at having to go through. That's a big number. A lot of time to sort through all of that and figure out which ones actually would apply to us. When we implemented the passive monitoring system, it was able to actually ingest all the devices we have, all the assets, and spit out a number. And it came back with 29 CVEs that applied to our environment, to all our assets and devices that we had out there. 2 of those were critical that we needed to address, and the rest were high, medium priorities. So we moved down from 214,000 to 29. That was a number that we could manage. That was a number that we could actually start working on and address those CVEs in our environment, not wasting our time trying to figure out which ones would apply and not. Then it also gave us the data we needed where we could start even engaging with third parties for vulnerability assessments. We now had the data, the asset inventory to give them, to bring in for them to do a valid or a quality assessment, not having to guess what we do or don't have in our network. And then last, we got into OT-specific incident response plan, disaster response plans. And the reason I say specific is because OT and IT are drastically different, especially in priorities. And I heard this mentioned this morning that typically you think of the CIA triangle, confidentiality, integrity, availability. And while that might apply in your IT environment, typically your OT environment switches that. Availability is top priority, then you worry about integrity and confidentiality. Especially for us, a lot of our data in our control system is public, open to public records requests or public information. So the confidentiality really isn't as big a concern as making sure that system is available 24/7, making sure that the integrity of that system is there. So that mindset kind of feeds into those incident response plans, those disaster recovery plans, and really makes them different. So having our asset visibility in place, knowing all the assets that are out there, we now know what we need to do, what we need to replace if we're ever hit by ransomware, for example. We can't fix, repair, replace what we don't know is out there. If we don't know about it, how do we fix it? We can't. So knowing it's there, we can now actually plan our incident response, our disaster recovery, and then we can test it with tabletops. I was so excited I heard tabletops mentioned earlier. Sitting down and going through those tabletops, planning for that really bad day, that's critical. And knowing our assets beforehand, building out those specific response plans to our SCADA network, we can now actually truly test those plans using tabletops, sitting down with even management in the room, operations, maintenance in the room, public relations in that room, and running through, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we protect, rebuild, recover our SCADA system. So we ended up, all these different things that we could build off asset visibility that we could get into because we had asset visibility in place. And that's why, for us, asset visibility really was that fundamental aspect we needed to build our cyber posture, to build our cybersecurity programs on. It gave us the understanding of our OT network, and the best way I think I've heard it explained over the years was we need to know our network better than the adversary. The adversary is advanced now. They have tools that can map out the network, that they can discover the devices out there. We've got to know it better. We've got to know the context around these assets and what's going on with them. So network asset visibility is one of the biggest benefits, in my opinion, that you can get in your OT environment. And that's really going to come through those passive, or the physical walkthroughs, the passive monitoring, the active scanning, and configuration management. So I appreciate it, and if anyone has questions, I'd be happy to try to answer. They've been joking about it all day. You really can't see hands well. But if anyone has questions, if not, thank you, and I'll be around.
That's a wrap for today.